Today on See It Now, Burma, Buddhism, and Neutralism. The sections having to do with Buddhism will be narrated by Unu, the former Prime Minister of Burma. Now, speaking to you from the control room of Studio 41 is Edward R. Murrow.
Good afternoon. Today, there are many new small nations around the world of which we know very little.
Welcome to the Insight Myanmar podcast. Before we get into today's show, I wanted to let you know that we have a lot more written and video content on our website. If you haven't visited it yet, we invite you to take a look at www.insightmyanmar.org. In addition to complete information about all of our past podcasts, there's also a variety of blogs, books, and videos to check out, and you can sign up for our regular newsletter as well. But for now, enjoy what follows, and remember, sharing is caring. I'm happy to be joined here at Insight Myanmar podcast by Kenton Clymer. He is the author of A Delicate Relationship, the United States and Burma, Myanmar since 1945. Kenton, thanks so much for taking the time to join us here today.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, so before we get into the history that you uncover in the book, one of the things I found interesting was just how you reported on that history. And more specifically, you give a kind of real-time analysis of what people are actually thinking in the embassy from the American side, and the embassy, State Department, Department of Defense, the CIA, the White House, etc. So you get these real-time views that are being reported from 45 onto almost present day of their evaluation of what happened and who was doing it, their critique of the particular leader, and so you get to see their real-time analysis, limited by what they know and what their concerns are. So I'm just curious, how did you go about documenting getting access to information of what so many people are writing and thinking and corresponding about in the moment of making decisions?
Well, like all historians, we are interested in historical documents, and to a lesser extent, interviews. I did some interviews, but the documentation is largely found in various public and private archives. In the United States, the place that historians looking for international relations history go is primarily to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and there are a number of record groups there which have kept much of the correspondence that went on between the State Department and the embassies, in this case the embassy in Rangoon, Burma. There are also CIA records available at the National Archives. There's a whole raft of them that until recently were a little more difficult to get to because you actually had to go to Washington, D.C. To see these records, which are in the case of the CIA, are computerized. And you had to go there. The National Archives does not like to have anything but the actual records. The CIA doesn't like to give them actual records. So they reached a compromise whereby they would digitalize a number of their records, and so you could see them in digital form, and then they would pay for researchers to simply copy them and print them out. But the bulk of the research anyway is actually in State Department documents. And then there are all of the presidents for that period of time have their own libraries. which often contain materials that are not in the archives, in the National Archives, and then records of certain individuals as well. So that's how it's done, and it's really quite interesting. You can be looking through these piles of papers, never quite sure what you're going to find, and sometimes you find really unexpected stuff, and so it's sort of fun to do that.
Was there something unexpected that stands out in your mind that you found while researching this book?
Well, one thing which is, I have a chapter in the book on Gordon Seagrave, who was the famous Burma surgeon. He was the most well-known American in Burma from the 1930s up until his death in 1965. He was a fourth-generation Baptist medical missionary. He later broke with the Baptists after World War II, had this hospital up there on the Chinese border. And I was just looking through the papers in the National Archives and discovered that he had been put on trial by the government of Burma in 1950 for high treason. And lo and behold, there was a whole transcript of the trial. I didn't even know about the trial, much less that I'd come across the transcript. And so that was the kind of exciting thing that you occasionally run across.
Yeah, that was a fun chapter to read about. I'd read his books that he had wrote during his lifetime, and getting to know about some of the background of the role he played was the context he was in was definitely quite interesting. As we go ahead and look at this conversation, where we're going to be examining what you uncovered about Burmese-U.S. relations, which I think is quite important to understand today in the current context. We're going to go through the different periods of world history that influence those relations, starting with World War II and the need to defeat the Japanese, going towards the independence movement, into the scare of communism, and especially Red China. The Vietnam War was happening, of course, during this time, transition to the war on drugs, and Burma was central there, and then to the current generation, you can say, characterized by democracy and human rights. But let's start first looking at the early days. I know that your book starts off post-World War II, but you do mention the first U.S.-Burma relations taking place with trade ships to India that are stopping over in Burma, and the role of teak, the role of missionaries, U.S. missionaries going over there, King Mindon and James Buchanan being the first official correspondents of heads of state of that early relationship with the U.S. pre-World War II. Anything that stands out that would be important that went on to later characterize the relations between the countries?
Well, to start in the beginning, in a sense, after American independence, why the Americans began their own trade with China, which had begun, of course, back when they were colonies. There was trade with the Asian countries. Some people will remember the Boston Tea Party in 1773, when they the Patriots threw chests of tea into the harbor, and that tea wasn't grown in South Carolina; it was grown in China. So there were these connections, and I guess what I was kind of surprised to discover was that. We sort of know about the China trade, that's very famous, but people know less about the trade with India, which began about the same time, and actually in the earlier days, probably there was more trade with India than there was with China. And some of those ships did stop along the way to places like Burma. So in one famous example, the Burma, and this was before Burma was taken over by the British, so it was an independent kingdom. And at one point, the king commandeered one of the American merchant ships and used it in his war with a neighboring kingdom, and imprisoned the crew until the war was over with. So things like that were very interesting. And then, but it is certainly true that the most important American interest in Burma in the 19th century were the missionaries, because although the Americans had very few, if any, they had, I should say, before the 20th century, they had very few, if any, missionaries, Protestant missionaries, anywhere else in Southeast Asia until the 20th century, and then there were more. But the Baptists ended up going to Burma in 1813, quite by chance, the original Baptist missionaries were supposed to go to India and did go to India in 1812, but they weren't liked there and found they had best leave, and so they left and got on the first ship, which was going to Burma, quite by chance, and so they started their missionary work there at a time when Burma was still an independent country. So following their episodes, at least a little bit, is important in the 19th century, since there were almost no other Americans around in that time, except for an occasional ship stopping there and so forth. And merchants, there may have been some merchants, but the missionaries were by far the most important American community well into the 20th century there.
That's interesting. Of course, there's entire communities of ethnics in Myanmar that trace their conversion back to the American missionaries. And last year, I happened to be reading a book about early Colorado. It was like, the Wild West in Colorado, and some memoir of like the mid-19th century. And out in the middle of the book, they reference Judson, the famous American missionary who went on to Burma, and it was a Christian family that was talking, and it was I think a visitor had stopped by a pioneer family, and the young boy was saying he wanted to grow up to be like Judson. And I was like, wow, this is, he's really kind of a celebrity among the Christian communities. Here I am reading a 19th century memoir of in Colorado, and they're referencing Judson. It blew my mind.
Oh, that is really interesting. Yeah, Judson was the Judsons were the first missionaries there, the ones that came in 1813. Yeah, and then I taught at Northern Illinois University, and in Rockford, Illinois, I think Elgin, Illinois, nearby, there is a Judson College, and it's part of that heritage.
Right. And then just speeding along until we get to the post-World War II era that your book focuses on, we have World War II. We have the Burma Road, the Lado Road, the Flying Tigers, OSS Department 101, the Secret Service there, the Kachin Rangers, coordination with different ethnic groups, just going at warp speed, all the different parts of American involvement in World War II. Again, I know your book picks up from post-war period, so we don't want to spend too much time here. The Burma Theater would be an entire podcast or series of podcasts on its own. But the question I want to leave you with here concerning World War II is, what legacy do you feel the American involvement in Burma in World War II had going forward that's important for us to know about?
Of course, Burma was hardly the central point of the war for the United States, but it did serve the purpose. The Americans did want China to stay in the war. And so when all of the other avenues into China were closed off by the Japanese, Burma was, for a time, the only way to get supplies into China. And then when the Japanese finally conquered Burma altogether, the only way left was to fly the very difficult trans-Himalayan flights of supplies into China. I think the other thing which came out of it to me, and something I wasn't all that familiar with, is the split between the ethnics, as you mentioned before, the various minority groups in Burma, of which there are many, and the Burman population, that they had quite different perspectives on things very often. The missionaries were active mostly among the ethnic peoples, the hill peoples, tribal groups as they were called. And in World War II, many of them were quite valiantly supportive of the Allied cause, whereas the Burmans were ambivalent and indeed sometimes favored the Japanese as a way of getting the British out. In fact, An Sang, the leader of the most important of the nationalist leaders for independence, had led an army which fought with the Japanese until he changed sides toward the end of the war. So I found all of that quite interesting. The war did, for those people who were interested, including the State Department, it did educate them about Burmese conditions, and the Americans generally came out of the war supportive of Burmese independence, and so I think the war was fairly significant in terms of the future.
Right, and as far as the British background went, the British, of course, had Burma as a colony. And as the war ended, there was definitely a split among different British departments of those that had seen the Burmans and seen General Aung San as something of a traitor and someone they did not want to work with, and really align themselves with the ethnics who they felt
yes, some of them wanted to arrest him for treason.
That's right. That's right. So there's this real split among the British about which direction to support and who to align with, and whether who to see as allies, and how to see the nation going forward. With the Americans at the time of the post-war period and the strive for independence and the Burman ethnic split, what was the American views on what they wanted or what they saw in the years after the war?
Well, I would say during the war, Franklin Roosevelt, I think you can characterize him quite well as an anti-colonialist, about as advanced an anti-colonialist as the president could probably be. He did express some kind of stereotypical negative views of the Burmese, some famous ones, but those were directed at Churchill. So maybe he was just playing up to Churchill's, sentiments about the Burmese. But after the war, my sense is that the Americans were quite open to any of the Southeast Asian independence movements as long as they were not communist. And the communist issue, was growing soon after the war, and as long as they could be defined as not communists, why the Americans were supportive of that, even if a little bit ambivalent because of their connections with the British, of course. Over time, the Americans we do have an anti-colonial past going back to the Revolution, but at the same time, that was heavily compromised in the 20th century, since the British, which was the largest and most important colonial country, was also our ally. But yeah, the war was important. That the Americans, I think, were quite pleased when Burma did get its independence, although fearful of the future because Burma was having so many problems.
Right, of course, and we'll get into those. Once Burma got its independence and American established relations with them, I noted from reading your book a few aspects of that the Americans were prioritizing in their relations with Burma at that time. One were growing economic goals and cooperation on that sphere. Another was education and where Fulbright program there, as well as educating Burmese in the U.S. And then a third was the ongoing legacy of the missionaries. What are your thoughts on this period? If I left anything out, or how would you highlight these priorities that they had at the time?
Well, the Americans wanted to, they welcomed Burma's independence, but they were concerned about the Chinese having undue influence in Burma. As you know, this is the end period for the Chinese Revolution, with Mao Zedong driving toward victory, and so the Americans were concerned and hoped that the Burmese would essentially, if not be exactly on our side, at least be anti-communist. And that was a problem in a sense because, as I note in the book, actually, the American perception of the early Burmese government under U Nu was that, the American ambassador thought that he was essentially a communist in terms of his philosophy. And yet, despite all of that, the Americans, I think, made the shrewd decision that they ought to support Burmese independence and support the central government of Burma because they did ultimately conclude that was the best course of keeping Burma independent, even if they were suspicious of the philosophy of some of the leadership. I don't know if that got exactly to your question. That jumped out to me anyway at the moment.
Yeah, well, we can go in that direction. So looking at U Nu, that was something I wanted to inquire about, was what the evaluation was of him at the time. And this is another of those cases where I think it's just so valuable reading how you're documenting the view at the time, because when we look back today in Burmese history, it's very tempting to see U Nu as kind of the last decent man who was trying to lead Burma, and he believed in democracy, and it was the coup that took democracy from him, and it's disappeared ever since until the 2010s. And so we have a different view based on what we knew happened at the time, but yet in the moment, as you catalog, there was some concerns that he was a good man, but he was weak, he was sympathetic to the communists. There were some concerns about him. And of course, different departments of the U.S. government, depending on what their perspective was, looked at him and Ne Win, and Ne Win, of course, being the dictator who took over in 1962, that looked at them in different ways according to their perspective. So how would you characterize the American evaluation of U Nu, knowing that it's not a blanket statement, that it changed over the years according to departments and people, with that kind of difference depending on who's looking and when they're looking? How would you characterize how he was seen?
Well, I think it's, first of all, maybe we ought to point out that he was not intended to be the prime minister. Of course, everyone assumed that Aung San would be the first prime minister, but as you and most of your listeners would know, Aung San was assassinated 6 months before Burma was scheduled to become independent, and so U Nu kind of inherited that. And he came in, and Burma was in such bad shape. And soon after he came in, he was beset by revolutions, including 2 communist revolutions, and various the Karen Rebellion, the Kachins, other ethnic groups going into resistance or rebellion, open rebellion. And so one has to be sort of sympathetic with the situation that U Nu faced. So I think that the Americans, as you said, they saw U Nu as a very good person, a very religious person, but they did think that he was not a very good administrator, aside from his possible his philosophy, which was definitely socialist, and in the view of some Americans was you couldn't tell much difference in that and the communists. But they did admire the fact that he did take on the local communists, the Burmese Communist Party, and their rebellion, which began soon after independence. He went after them. And he, for a time, I believe, if I'm not mistaken about this, he kicked them out of the governing party, although did not rule out that some of them might be able to come back into it. And so they sort of admired that, but they in the early Cold War years, why there was concern about weak leaders in these third world countries not being able to stand up to communism. And there was concern about whether U Nu was strong enough to do that. So they looked at Ne Win, who actually in 1950 or 51 had gone so far as to convey to the Americans his willingness to have the Americans to aside essentially with the Americans in the Cold War, as long as they would retain a sustaining financing for the military and sending trainers over and that kind of thing. And then he eventually backed away from that, but here he was showing that, he was truly anti-communist and favorable to the United States. And here's U Nu, who is appears to be much more genuinely neutral. I do think, in terms of, to just have a slight side mark here, that the United States in the Cold War, especially the early Cold War, is seen often as looking at things very black and white. You're either for us or you're against us. And yet, despite their concerns with U Nu, and also, one might say, despite the fact that the people who are resisting U Nu, the Karens and some of the other ethnic people, have been strong supporters of the United States, strong supporters of the West and the British. And yet, in the end, the United States decided that it ought to throw its weight behind the government of Burma, despite its sympathies and so forth. There's kind of a realpolitik judgment, which made a lot of sense. But anyway, then when Ne Win decided to take over in 1958, in a kind of coup, which the American ambassador called a polite coup, the Americans were not at all unhappy about that. And that the Americans had nothing to do with the origins of it, as far as I know. But they saw advantages here. Here is Ne Win, more reliably anti-communist, and a good administrator who will bring military military judgments toward how to run the society, and so it'll be run more easily, and Burma will be safe. I mean, Rangoon will be safe, and the streets cleaned up, and this kind of thing. And so they were not unhappy with him taking over. But then he kept in power for too long.
Right. Going back to your earlier point, I think it's really insightful and interesting going back to look at that who they decided to support, and seeing that you have these ethnic groups that are that where the Christian missionaries lived among. So there was a lot of experience in previous generations and contacts with Americans going there. Of course, these were the closer allies during World War II, who they fought alongside. And then you had in the period of the 1950s that was such a period of conflict in Myanmar at the time, Burma at the time. You mentioned the communists, but the Karen really had a very serious rebellion that U Nu had to confront. So what can you tell us about what the aims of the Karens were and the threat they posed, and the American decision of how they wanted to respond to it?
Well, I think the larger point is that the Karens in particular, but also many of the other ethnic groups, were very suspicious of a union of Burma, which would have a Burman majority and Burman control, because for a long time they had not been getting along particularly well with the Burmans. It's sometimes said that the British had encouraged this with a kind of divide and conquer rule. And there may be something to that, but I think there were other reasons as well why they were suspicious of each other. The Karens wanted either an autonomous area of Burma that they would essentially control, or an independent Karen state. And there were negotiations about that. But they never ultimately came to anything. Ne Win was very much opposed to this, incidentally. He was opposed to making concessions to these minority groups. But there were efforts to do it, but they never came to anything, and so the rebellion continued. I guess it's still going on in some respects, and so it's the longest-lasting civil war in the world, or something like that. So they want an autonomous area or an independent state, as I understand it.
Right. And it's really remarkable to look back today and to realize that American policy actually had the choice of supporting the claims of what some of these ethnic areas wanted, that the Americans were more closely aligned with historically, and yet they supported the strong central Burman government, and this is still a conflict that's playing out today.
Yep, and they made it very explicit that they did not support the Karens or others.
Yeah, and there were individual Americans that were quite upset about that. You chronicle over the next several decades various individual missionaries as well as ex-soldiers that are breaking with official American policy by, or in some cases, maybe being a part of covert American policy, but they are living among the ethnics and supporting their own revolution and independence.
Right, yes, there certainly were some like that. I think in the case of the missionary community, which I know the best, I think probably everyone was very sympathetic to the Karens. Whether they actually engaged in activity designed to help them in against the Burmans, I think is questionable. But they certainly sympathized with them.
Right. So we're talking a bit about the ethnics and some of the conflict that was going on between them and the Burmans, but looking now to the communists, and there was the Burma Communist Party, the BCP, and there was also the civil war in China, which Mao was winning. And this fear of communism, the domino effect, and the specter of China, they all weighed really heavy on American policy in the region. Can you tell us what the Americans were doing in Burma at this time to try to prevent the advance of communism from taking a hold in Burma, and just the importance they saw in Burma at this time?
Well, there are a number of things with respect to the government. Again, the Americans are supporting the government, and they want to have. They want to extend assistance, economic assistance. They want to extend military assistance as well, and they want to encourage the Burmese to indicate that they don't want to work with the Chinese communists. Having said that, there is one area where they are not supporting the government of Burma, and that was the covert support that the American government took toward the remnants of the Chinese nationalist forces that had been driven out or escaped into northern Burma. Several thousand of them escaping beginning in 1949 and continuing over the next couple of years. It built up and they're run by a General Lee Me, who I guess is quite a competent person in terms of his military skills, and they were there, and the fact that they were there and organized and threatening to invade Yunnan, the southern province of China there, was something which deeply bothered the Burmese, because this would give the new Chinese government an excuse to move into Burma, to root out these nationalist soldiers that were there. And all of the American ambassadors who were there during this period of time sympathized with the Burmese about all of this. But the CIA, with the support, obviously, of the president, was secretly supporting the Kuomintang forces, the KMT forces, the Chinese nationalist forces there, and arming them and bringing supplies into them and this kind of thing. And the Burmese knew all about this, but from their own intelligence. But the American ambassadors didn't know about it officially, but were often able to figure it out. And that caused serious rifts between the Burmese government and the United States government in this period. So the purpose, obviously is to stop the spread of communism, but usually while they're supportive of the government of Burma, in this one instance that they were not. Perhaps I should put it in context too. This is while the Korean War is going on. The Korean War starts in the summer of 1950, and to the extent that there was any strategic thinking about why the Americans ought to support the nationalist Chinese in Burma, it was that the Chinese entered the Korean War in the fall of 1950, and so if you could start a kind of a second front down there in the south, they might have to withdraw some of their troops from the north, take some pressure off of the north. This was all very foolish thinking. I think most people think now. Certainly the American ambassadors did. But that, in any case, the very fact that it was there, the very fact that the Burmese had figured it all out, why it was a terrible, it caused terrible difficulties for the relationship for a number of years.
And one of the things I was interested to read in your book about that period was the split in the American community of that action and of the wise course of action that one should be pursuing, because of course the different departments of the United States at that time were all aligned in wanting to stop the spread of communism, and yet the CIA is undertaking this action that it believes is undermining communist influence in Burma, and yet people on the ground, as ambassadors, as you mentioned, people in the embassy, are declaring the opposite. They're saying they have the same goals, but they're saying what you're doing is going to make it a powder keg, where communism, by supporting the KMT, you're actually giving rise to conditions that are going to make the spread of communism much, much more dangerous. So there's that split in evaluating the course of these actions.
And in addition to that, the nationalist troops and their families and so forth in Burma are misbehaving. At least there are reports that they're pillaging villages and so forth, and so the Burmese don't want them there. It's just a bad situation.
And this is all looking at it from the angle of American fears about China's potential influence on Burma. But what do we know about Burma's attitude towards this rising communist China? What are their priorities and interests at this time?
Well, all along, down to the present time, they have to be concerned and aware of China because they have a very long border with China. What is it, 1,500 miles or something like that? A very long border with China. And so, of course, they are going to have a little different views of it than the Americans might at some distance away. So it's always a factor in their thinking during that time and up to the present time. But they don't want to be dominated by China, and so even if they have to be aware of China, even if they might sympathize with China sometimes, they don't want to be under the dominating influence of China or anybody else, for that matter. And that's pretty consistent, I think, all through the last part of the 20th century and down to the present time. And that's evident in this period as well. In terms of, to jump ahead just a little bit to Ne Win's rule too, Ne Win doesn't like a close connection with China, but during his term in office, after the Americans and Ne Win have kind of made up, why there are anti-Chinese riots in Burma. And I suspect Ne Win is kind of encouraging that, maybe. And they almost break diplomatic relations. And the Chinese are calling him all sorts of unpleasant names. So it's a kind of a balancing act. They know China's there. They know they have to deal with China. China can provide certain things for them as well. So that's they're ambivalent, but they don't want China, as far as I can tell, to dominate in Burma at all, nor the United States, nor the British, nor the Indians.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So to put a bow on this chapter on the KMT and the CIA covert support, what ends up happening with the American relationships to the KMT? And then once that does start to dissipate, what happens to those remnants of KMT in Burma?
Yeah, that's an interesting and kind of murky question. Initially, the Americans were, as we've said, supportive of the KMT. The CIA continued its support into 1952, probably 1953, maybe even part of 1954. But eventually there was so much pushback on it that the United States agreed to put pressure on Taiwan to end this fiasco and get out as many troops as it was reasonable to or possible to get out of Burma. I mean, this was, and Chiang Kai-shek was initially very much opposed to this and resisted the Americans. But in 1954, under American pressure, they did agree to withdraw some of their troops. It's a complicated story, actually, because initially Chiang Kai-shek had agreed to do it, but it was intended as kind of a hoax, a faux withdrawal. But then he changed his mind and decided on a real withdrawal, keeping that quite secret because of the fear that the nationalists in Burma would resist. But in the end, they withdrew 6,000 or 7,000 of their troops in 1954, but that still left several thousand troops or KMT people in Burma. And it kept flaring up from time to time. There was a flare-up in the late 1950s, and then certainly in 1960-61, which caused one of the reasons I think that Ne Win decided he had to come back in power. He was very angry at the United States because of the KMT situation. They blamed the United States for continuing to support the KMTs. I'm not sure whether the United States was still involved in the 1960s with the KMT, but they were still, some of them were still there, some of them were still causing problems. And one thing which I forgot to mention, at one point, UNU secretly allowed the Chinese communists to send in troops to drive out the KMTs. And so for a period of time, they did that. So the KMTs were weakened, but there's still Chinese villages in the northern part of Burma. They got involved in the opium trade later on. As far as I guess there's still Chinese villages there.
So we could move on to 1958, which was where Ne Win initially took over power. You mentioned that the Americans called this a polite coup, and that it was not altogether unwelcome, that some saw it as bringing stability, law and order, certainly anti-communism, even though democracy was suspended. And it appears that Ne Win was, you couldn't necessarily say he was poorly regarded. There was a report or two where they characterized him as temperamental or superstitious. There was quotes, you put emotional and subjective factors. So how did the Americans see this 1958 takeover, and how did they view Ne Win specifically?
Yeah, I think that that comment about the negative comment about Ne Win goes back to something that Ambassador Key might have said in the early 1950s, kind of warning against Ne Win. But the Americans were generally happy with what he did in 1958 when he took over from Nu Wu in this kind of constitutional coup. And only after he did not quickly turn things back into a democratic state. I guess he said he would do it in 6 months. It took him 18 months. The Americans became uneasy with Ne Win, and were not unhappy when he turned to when he did allow a fair election, which U Nu won quite easily, much to his distress, and maybe somewhat to the U.S. distress as well. And the Americans then said that over time, over the next year and a half or so, that Ne Win when U Nu was in power again, that the things were returning to the way they had been, which was not very good in terms of law and order and stability.
Of course, a big turning point in the relationship between the United States and Ne Win, particularly, was his visit to Walter Reed Hospital. Can you tell us what happened in that incident?
Yeah, that was another interesting thing to find in the archives for me. In 1960, when he was out of power as prime minister, I guess he's still minister of defense, maybe, he goes to Washington, D.C. He's invited to Washington, D.C. The Americans wanted him to come, and he came, and the visit was a disaster for a number of things. Ne Win was someone who did not like a lot of formal meetings and so forth, or formal occasions, but the Americans planned some, and especially some meetings that he was supposed to attend, and he did attend them, and then the Americans who were going to be there weren't there, and it was all very embarrassing, and that certainly didn't help. But the most egregious thing that happened was when he was in Walter Reed Hospital. He was, I think, a bit of a hypochondriac, although he did have some serious issues. And when he'd go to England or the United States, he would check into these hospitals to be checked out. And he's in the hospital, and his wife, Kitty, is there along with her entourage. And they're going up and down the hall looking for a nurse or something. And then a screeching voice comes out from one of the neighboring rooms using a racial epithet and telling him to get out of there. And the voice who said that might have been Mamie Eisenhower, the wife of the president, which was kind of is a little unexpected, because Mamie Eisenhower had a reputation as being quite moderate on racial issues and so forth. But when I found out about that, I was actually in Washington. I was at the Wilson Center for a few months. Very kind of them to invite me and work on this book. And one of the perks of being at the Wilson Center is that you get an assistant to help you. And I asked my assistant, these are students, mostly graduate students, or undergraduate students, actually, in one case. And I said, this is the day that Ne Win was in the hospital and this thing happened. And could you check and see if Mamie Eisenhower was in the hospital at that particular time? I didn't know how to check. And in 2 minutes, he found out. And I said that she was there. And I said, well, how did you find that out? And he said, well, I looked at the White House logs. And President Eisenhower had gone to visit his wife on that day or something. And so there she was. She was in the hospital. They obviously both would have been in the VIP section. And so it's not at all impossible that it happened. And there is some evidence that it was she. So the upshot of that was that this plus the renewal of the KMT activities about the same time turned Ne Win bitterly anti-American. And when he got back to Burma, he just fumed about what had happened. He told one Burmese informant said that he was so angry that he would not eat American corn. He's just very, very, very angry about what had happened. And the Americans knew this. The Americans in the State Department knew all of this, and they tried desperately to get him to come back to the United States to make up. And eventually, 4 years later, 6 years later, really, in 1966, they did persuade him to come back for a state visit, and they pulled out all the stops with President Johnson to make amends for what had happened in 1966. And there is, for any of your listeners that might be interested, if you look on YouTube, you can find a little public relations thing about this visit that he made to Washington in 1966. It's really very interesting, and it's only about 10 minutes, but it shows all the pomp and circumstance and the parade in Washington and going to Walter Reed Hospital and meeting with President Johnson and the State Department people, and it's a little piece of propaganda, but it's really very interesting to see. And that actually seemed to help with the relationship. After that, the relationship was not close, but it was probably better.
So before we get to 1962, I realize I just want to back up for one final moment, and that was what you had alluded to this early on in the talk, Gordon Seagrave. You have a whole chapter on his life and his trial and the importance of that in Burma-U.S. relations. So what was that?
Well, he was charged with treason, high treason, for allegedly assisting the Karen rebels. The Karen rebels, led by Na Sang, who I guess is actually a Kachin, but it was in charge of the Karen army at that point, came to his town of Nam Kam near the Chinese border in Shan State and took it over. And then they were there for a while, and then the Burmese army came in and drove them out and stayed in the hospital area for a while. And so the Burmese charged him with helping the Karens by giving them medical supplies and sympathizing with them and so forth. And so they they arrested him and brought him to Rangoon, and he stood trial for that. I thought it was quite a fair trial. This is early after Burmese independence, and the court actually did not convict him of high treason. It convicted him of a lesser charge of assisting someone who was committing high treason. And this, in terms of U.S. relations here, the State Department is very leery about him appealing these things because they realize that this is causing a strain in U.S. relations because of Seagrave's reputation back in the United States. And here the saintly surgeon, is being put on trial by these colonial peoples. But Seagrave appeals, and then on appeal, the appeals court throws out the most important charge, but it continues. There's one other charge which is left in, but they free him for time served, so to speak. He's free to go. And the State Department is hoping that that'll be the end of it, but Seagrave finally decides to appeal that as well to the Supreme Court of Burma. And in the end, that court exonerates him, although it warns him and says it's all your fault. You brought it on yourself by actions which an ordinary citizen might well have considered, subversive. So it was very interesting. And then he went back to. Then he got permission to go back to Nam Kam. Ne Win was very much opposed to this, incidentally. That was what delayed him going back to Nam Kam. And thereafter, I'm working on this right now, but thereafter he doesn't seem to have done anything that would damage his dealings with the government. And in fact, there was certainly a reconciliation within a matter of 2 or 3 years. So it's an interesting kind of case.
Yes, certainly. It was definitely an interesting chapter. And then moving along to a very significant date in Burmese history, 1962. This is the final takeover by Ne Win that sets in motion decades and decades of military government with just a slight transition that was attempted by another coup last year, as we all know. But let's look at 1962. So Ne Win takes over. The American response to this, again, is quite grounded in their view and their concern, their fear, really, of a communist takeover. And so through that prism, how do they view the events of 1962?
Well, I don't know if they are quite as favorable to it as they were in 1958, but and they don't like what Ne Win does in the sense of snuffing out civil liberties and this kind of thing. But they do learn, and of course he's very anti-American at that point. This is not so long, after his the experiences in Washington. But they do conclude that he is genuinely non-aligned. And while he certainly isn't going to be close to the Americans or the West in general, he's also not going to turn the country over to the Chinese or the Russians. And so the Americans say that they can live with him. It's not going to be a close relationship, but they can live with that. And so they make their peace essentially with Ne Win. And that's how it goes for, the rest of the other decades.
Yeah, it really seems like between 1962 and 1988, aside from maybe 74, which was the funeral of the Secretary General U Thant, and there was a bit of a skirmish there, it's really a pretty dark period where not much is happening in terms of the relations. And you report on various American observers and ambassadors who simply seem to say every few years, like, yep, he's still non-aligned, he's still not really a threat, and things in civil liberties and poverty is still getting worse and worse, but there's nothing we could really do, and there's not much concern we really have to have. And that seems to characterize the relationship for those years.
Yeah, and it's partly Ne Win's doing, in the sense that Ne Win is isolating his country and doesn't want foreign contact, and he kicks out most foreigners. I guess the group that suffered the most probably were the Indians, and because they controlled much of the. Many of them were merchants and moneylenders and so forth, and they had to return to India. But the Americans also were kicked out. They kicked out the Ford Foundation. They kicked out the Asia Foundation, the Foundation or Society, and they seized all private property, including all of the several hundred schools that the Baptist missionaries had, and their hospitals, and nationalized them. And all the missionaries had to leave. So Ne Win is drawing into his shell, or into the shell. Burma is not friendly with foreign countries. There's a time when tourist visas are only good for 24 hours, and then for a long time just for 7 days. And there is that, but as a result of that too, he's no longer as much of a factor in the Cold War. There was concern about his views toward Vietnam. Of course, Vietnam is going on in the 60s, and that was another reason for inviting him to Washington, so that he would hopefully, if not side with the Americans in Vietnam, not follow the Chinese advice, which was to condemn the Americans in Vietnam. So when it became apparent that he would not attack the Americans or necessarily take the Chinese side of things in Vietnam, that helped remove Burma as a factor in that situation. And then, of course, beginning with Nixon in 1971, the United States begins to change its policy toward China. That's when he flies, in 72, when he flies to Beijing. So suddenly the Americans are cozying up to China as a way of kind of containing the Soviet Union. And so it is, and Chinese-Burma relations are okay. So it's just no longer that much of an important factor in the Cold War. But as part of that, he forbade Burmese diplomats from talking with American diplomats on most occasions. One of my friends actually was the consul at Mandalay in the late 70s. And, he didn't have a lot to do. He couldn't talk to his Burmese counterparts. And they're kind of twiddling their thumbs there because there's just not much to do. With the one exception, which you're probably going to get to, the narcotics area. That's the one area of connection.
Yeah, we'll get to that in just a moment. There's one other thing I wanted to touch on in this period where not much is going on. One big thing is the Vietnam War, and you touched on that. The other thing that I wanted to get to was there are a couple of attempted coups, rebellions, revolutions that are fomenting among the ethnic groups, sometimes supported by some measure of support. We're not exactly sure what, by former OSS members or missionaries playing some role. There's UNU, who's also trying to do something. And these different attempts are trying to get U.S. support, and they all just fall flat. So what can you tell us about these attempts to unseat Ne Win during this period?
Oh, I think the Americans are kind of curious about it, but I don't think they ever were seriously thinking of getting involved in it. The UNU one was kind of interesting. He did gather some steam. He was in the United States talking about it. Then there was a plane that came over and dropped leaflets over Rangoon, which embarrassed the Burmese, so they couldn't stop that. The pilot was an American. But I don't think the American government was ever involved in anything serious in terms of compromising activity against the government. There's the one thing I can think of is that the CIA did run some listening posts up along the border with China, I guess aimed at China, in Shan State. And in return, they paid the Shan, one of the Shan armies to protect them. And so that, in that sense, that was kind of an infringement on Burmese sovereignty, I guess.
What stood out to me that I didn't know was UNU's involvement. I think I had some inkling that he was trying something, but just how far he got, that he was actually on the Thai border. I can't quite remember the details, but I think in coordination with some people in the Thai military authorities who were supported him, and there was a training camp, and was actually pretty far along a possibility of looking to do something and never materialized. But it wasn't just talk; it was actually building up to what could have been encouraging a revolution from the Thai side.
Mm-hmm. And they had a couple of radio stations, I think, broadcasting into Burma, maybe in Burma, but mostly in Thailand, I think. UNU had political asylum in Thailand. The Thais were involved in all of these things, of course. They were involved with the Chinese nationalist forces as well, as with the United States, and they were facilitating the CIA in its efforts to supply the Chinese nationalists. So, yeah, there's a lot of Thai interest here. The Burmese and the Thais don't always get along very well, as you probably know.
Yeah, and definitely seeing how the countries and the peoples are changing their relationship through the decades. I mean, right now, the Thai authorities are really no friends of the Burmese people by and large. The Thai people are different. The Thai people on the border there are reports of them welcoming refugees these days, but Thailand is not a great democracy either. So it was interesting to read back at that point that the Thai side was actually encouraging the UNU's attempted rebellion against the Burmese military, because certainly there are much more friendlier relations between the militaries today.
Mm-hmm. We had the Thai foreign minister came to my university a few years ago, and he was asked about the Thais' relationships with Burma. And he was bemoaning the fact, he said, that the only thing that the Thais know about Burma is that in 1757, the Burmese sacked Ayutthaya.
Right. I remember going to Shwedagon, the famous pagoda in Yangon, with some Thai friends one time. And she smiled and looked at all the gold on the pagoda and said, like, how much do you think this is Thai gold? And then she laughed. She's joking, but she laughed. And she said, I guarantee you, every Thai person who comes here, they're going to make that joke and they're going to think that thing. So how much of this Shwedagon gold came from Thailand? But moving on to the war on drugs, which you inferred just before. So, right, this is the other big thing that's happening before 1988, another touchstone moment, that there becomes a concern with drugs.
Well, this is if I'm not mistaken, this is the beginning of our famous war on drugs. President Nixon was concerned about cheap heroin, I guess, and other opiates that were making their way to Vietnam, which American soldiers were taking, and obviously not hindering their military abilities, I guess. And so he was very concerned about that, plus the fact that American cities were beginning to be kind of inundated with drugs, or at least reportedly so. And as I understand it, in the past, most of these drugs had come from Turkey through France and ultimately came to the United States. But beginning in the 60s, the Golden Triangle area, where Burma and Thailand and Laos come together, there was a drug industry there which was beginning to become increasingly important, and that was where the drugs were getting to the Americans in Vietnam, and I guess also in the United States as well. So, one reads about heroin. If you've read Al McCoy's book, The Politics of Heroin, heroin and opium. From opium were coming. I don't know really what other kinds of opiates were being produced, but heroin was the big one, I gather, that was being grown at that time, and it involved different groups in Burma, the Chinese, the nationalist Chinese. Some of the ethnic groups were also growing opium. It was a lot more profitable than growing other crops. And the Burmese government, in fact, under Ne Win, at least initially, was very much opposed to opioids, and that's why there was some cooperation between the United States and his government there on that one issue. He was happy to have American intelligence reports about this subject, caravans moving and so forth in various areas, which he accepted. Ultimately, he accepted American helicopters and American fixed-wing airplanes to suppress the trade, and that was controversial because what they were spraying, among other things, I guess, was the chemical 2,4-D, which is, I guess, partly the same thing that's in Agent Orange, and eventually protests grew up about that. I don't know how effective it was. I talked with one of the American ambassadors who had been there in the 1980s, and he seemed to think that it was at least partly effective. Although the amounts which came out didn't seem to be decreasing over time. So I don't know. From the standpoint of American-Burmese relations, I think the one thing which stood out to me is that this was the only issue about which the Americans could really talk to the Burmese. And so American diplomats could actually talk to those in Burma who were involved in trying to suppress the drug trade, or with American diplomats that had some interest in that whole thing. So that gave them some ability to get into what was happening in Burma.
Mm-hmm. And they were collaborating with the Americans, providing, as you mentioned, different military equipment and chemicals meant purely for the eradication of the crops, but these were then used for different purposes. The ethnic suffered under the chemicals. And as a side note that you might find interesting, I mentioned to a mutual friend that I was going to be talking with you, and she referenced a visit that she took to the, I don't remember the exact name, the Armed Forces or Tamadam Museum in Myanmar, that she went to with David Mathiasen, who, of course, is a noted writes about humanitarian aid and the conflict in Myanmar for some time. And they went to visit this together, and referencing your book, David told my friend, as they were walking through, there were actually exhibits of some of the military helicopters in the museum that had placards that were indicating that they were being used for military missions. And these were some of this equipment through David's knowledge, knew that this was the equipment that was provided for the drug trade, and the Tatmadaw Museum was openly promoting it being used for military purposes, even though, of course, this went against the design and their promises that it would be used only for the opium and the eradication of drugs.
Well, it wasn't quite that cut and dried, because the agreements did give them the right to use it for other purposes if it wasn't being used for spraying. And there was a lot of debate about the Burmese, interpreting that very, very liberally, and the Americans hoping that wasn't entirely the case. So it was a little bit, but they certainly were not intended to be used mostly, for military purposes, as the critics claimed that they were.
Another thing that surprised me about this section was you're referencing Ne Win as being someone who is so staunchly, at least at the beginning, anti-drug, anti-corruption, not just anti-drug in terms of wanting not to see drugs in Burmese society, but not even wanting to profit off of them in financially. And knowing what we know now about the close ties between the drug trade and where the Tatmadaw and the military gets its income, among many other revenue sources, it was surprising and interesting for me to read how and not just anti-drug, but also anti-corruption that Ne Win was regarded, even in contrast to U Nu's government. Not so much U Nu himself, but the government, the shaky government that he was leading. Ne Win was really seen as someone that was strongly and authentically in the beginning anti-drug, anti-corruption, and having these values.
Well, my sense, and it's only a sense, is that over time, apparently, the drug trade was actually quite important to Burma's economy generally, and that they had to tolerate a certain amount of it. And I guess later on, some of the military people were involved in the drug trade. Not initially. Ne Win was really very careful about that, but I think over time, maybe he had to relax his views on that. I can't give you any statistics on how many.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. One last point before we get to 1988. I believe you reference in your book that even during this terrible authoritarian period where we see the diminished rights going and the lack of human rights generally in Myanmar at the time, there are members of the Tatmadaw that are going to the United States and receiving some kind of training. Is that right?
Yes. That was quite common with American relations with Southeast Asian countries, that if they could help train the military, then they saw that as the best bastion for close ties and anti-communist postures. And so the Americans did have a small training program and the Burmese had agreed to it, that brought Burmese officers to the U.S. for training. Yes. Sometimes it was interrupted, depending if there were bad relations. But I don't know when it faded out, but it certainly was there.
Right, that was another thing that surprised me. Moving to 1988, this is the second real touchstone moment in recent Burmese history after 1962. 88, everything breaks loose. Everything comes out in the open with the civil unrest and protest against the increasingly authoritarian nature of Ne Win's regime at the time. Can you lay out from 1988 and then 89 and 90 as things progress, what was happening and the American response at this time?
Well, after the Burmese government had cracked down on the people who came out to protest, and Aung San Suu Kyi had begun to take sort of command of everything, those Americans, at least who were aware of what was happening and interested in what was happening, were highly critical, of course, of Ne Win and the Tatmadaw and the Burma government in general for the atrocities that they had committed. Several thousand people killed, and a lot of people arrested, and so forth. What happened, and this was kind of a theme in the last part of the book there, is that there does develop a difference in approach between the Congress on the one hand and the administrations on the other about how to respond to it. And the anger found particular expression in the Congress, which wanted to impose hard sanctions right away on the government of Burma, try to stop exports and imports and get American firms to withdraw and that kind of thing. And the response of the administrations, beginning with President Reagan, since this started when he was still president, going through George H.W. Bush and Clinton, was not that strong. They were reluctant to impose strong sanctions, partly, I think, because they didn't like Congress telling them what to do, but also because they felt the need to have more flexibility in dealing with these issues. And the Congress was more emotional about it, reflecting the will of the people that were interested in Burmese affairs and the great influence of Aung San Suu Kyi because she was so charismatic and so persuasive. So all the way, Reagan was very reluctant, just as he had been reluctant to support the People Powers movement in the Philippines. He's reluctant to cut ties with the Burmese government, and George H.W. Bush feels somewhat the same way, expressing anger, willing to criticize, but not willing to take strong action. Another thing which Bush wanted to do was to appoint a new ambassador to Burma. The former ambassador, Bert Levin, who wrote, incidentally, some very moving reflections of what had happened in 1988, involving himself and the American embassy, and what the protesters felt about the Americans at that time. He retired, or his term ended in 1990, and there's kind of a myth out there that then the United States decided it was going to punish the Burmese by not sending another ambassador, and there wasn't another ambassador sent until 2012, but Bush tried to send an ambassador twice. His good friend Frederick Vreeland, he had agreed to appoint as ambassador to Burma, and he was going through the process of getting appointed ambassador and going through the necessary hearings in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And two things happened. First of all, the resume that was presented to the Foreign Relations Committee was fake. Because Vreeland was actually a CIA agent for most of the years before he was nominated to be head of to be ambassador to Burma, and the Foreign Relations Committee does not like to be given fake resumes. But then they did finally figure out a way that they could get him appointed. There would be a public hearing about it, in which the senators would express their displeasure, and then there would be a private executive meeting at which Vreeland would say how sorry he was that this had happened. But for some reason, by the time it got to that point, the Burmese government had decided that it didn't want him to be. They vetoed his appointment anyway, so he never got to be the ambassador. And then there was another person, much more qualified, really, to be an ambassador, Peter Borg, who was well qualified and a senior member of the Foreign Service. And he spent time learning Burmese and preparing to go, but he never got his hearing because of the opposition from important senators, opposition to appointing anybody. So that's just an indication. I mean, on the one hand, the president wants to resume sort of kind of relatively normal relationships, and the Congress refuses to go along with it. And that continues through Clinton's administration until his second administration, at which point he finally does agree to the passage of some severe sanctions against Burma in 1997, I think.
That was really interesting to me. Yeah, I also, you reference how there's this myth that it was a reaction to the protests that they had dropped down the status of from ambassadors and charge d'affaires, and yeah, that was a myth that I had always thought. So that was another really interesting part of this book. A lot of gems in there for people interested in U.S.-Burma relations to discover.
I wouldn't have known about that, except that that time I was at the Wilson Center, there was also an analyst there named Marvin Ott, whom you may have heard of. He writes things from time to time about Burma and other areas. And he happened to be at the Wilson Center, and I talking to him and then interviewing him. And he's the one who told me about that because he was deeply involved in that with the staffer as a staffer. So he told me that whole story. And then that caused me to look up the actual hearings, which, unlike most hearings, was not published. And so I had to find it deep in the archive somewhere. And anyway, so it was interesting to me, too, to find out about that.
And this is important things to come back to, because when we're repeating the same mythology and false history of what we think happened and shaping that to fit present day how we're viewing things, then we're not living authentically in the past of that moment. And that's also what I appreciate with how you cover 1988, because even though I'm well acquainted with Burmese history, I think the thing that really kind of crystallized in reading how you cover 1988 onwards is realizing that not only was 1988 this moment of Aung San Suu Kyi rising and her charisma and the people power, and then, of course, what was happening in the world at that time with the Soviet Union and other countries and that context of greater freedoms coming. But what really crystallized in my mind was that it wasn't that 1988 was a greater push for democracy in Burma. It was really that this changed the nature of the game. That before 1988, the understanding of the wider support of human rights and what an authoritarian regime meant, and the lack of freedoms and the poverty and all of this, it was just kind of off the radar of a lot of people, except for just maybe a few real ardent activists and advocates here and there that were paying attention. But for the most part, it wasn't really a flag that was being carried by organizations or parts of Congress or anywhere else. And the way that we look at the situation in Burma, Myanmar today is really born on what happened in 88 and how the world responded and the reaction to it. This really changed the game of how Burma was seen and how American policy goals towards Burma were oriented after they viewed what happened in 88.
Yeah, no, that's nicely put, yeah.
All right, so looking after 1988, 1990, there's this democracy movement, there's sanctions that are happening, but really not a lot is changing. This is kind of the tragic, dreadful story of the recent history of Burma, that things are just staying the same as the world moves on. Lack of opportunity, lack of human rights, lack of any safety and security, and it's just kind of dragging on. And we get into George W. Bush's reign. And another thing that I didn't know when I was reading this is because I had always seen George W. and especially Laura as particular friends of the Burmese people and the democracy movement, but this was not how he started his term. This was a development that happened midway through his term that changed his and especially his wife's orientation towards the country and the people. So tell us about what that incident was in 2003 and how it shifted the Bush's feelings towards Burma at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, initially, as you said, the Bush had almost no interest in what was happening in Myanmar. Initially, then in 2003, that was the Tepe Inn incident, if I'm not mistaken, in which Suu Kyi is on the outskirts of Mandalay, I think, and her convoy was attacked, and she was maybe the one of the ASEAN Parliament groups or committee or something thought that it was an assassination attempt. It may have been, and a lot of people died in it. But as a result of that, there were some new sanctions passed, strong ones, which Bush signed. In fact, maybe I could make the point here that the opposition to the government in Burma in these years, the opposition in the United States was very much bipartisan. I mean, one of the leaders in the opposition was Mitch McConnell, So there sometimes you see this. One commentator said that it was a lefty kind of issue, but it really wasn't. The most conservative people in the Congress were very much opposed to it, and Aung San Suu Kyi had almost universal support. But anyway, as the things got worse during the second Bush administration, he took some executive actions, and then in 2007, where was the Saffron Revolution, which is the most serious resistance movement to the military since 1988. And Laura Bush was particularly angered in this in the very early stages of it. She announced to the world essentially that they ought to topple the government of Burma. And so she became something of a hero. She became, I call her, she's George Bush's Madeleine Albright, because in the Clinton administration, Madeleine Albright had been one who was very favorable to Aung San Suu Kyi and she and others, I think, helped turn the Clinton's willingness to sign some significant acts against Burma. The Bush administration then did come around and become firmly against what was happening in Burma.
And after the Saffron Revolution was Cyclone Nargis, just less than a year later, that devastated the Delta area. And this was a period where Americans were, the American aid was ready to come in along with aid from other countries. There were actually ships, American ships that were ready to come deliver aid, that were just stationed just in the ocean waiting for the word. And the Burmese military did not allow it. They barely even allowed their own people. I say this from experience because I was living there at the time. My apartment in Yangon was destroyed by the cyclone. I barely made it out alive, so I can give a lot of personal testimony to my time there. But my Burmese friends were barely able to get from Yangon, were barely able to get in themselves. Getting a little on a tangent here, but that was just an interesting moment for me to live through because experientially it was really and I've seen this documented later on, but I was living through it. So I remember what it was feeling like at the time. It was a real growth of Burmese civil society because you had this enormous natural disaster that took place. And I should actually let me back up because I think this might be interesting for you as well. I was at the time I was training at the American Center, which was connected to the U.S. Embassy. So I would also spend some time at the embassy and had friends there. And on the eve of Cyclone Nargis, the PAO had alerted me about the storm coming, and really she was the only one, and pretty terrified expression, like something big is happening. And my students that I was teaching at the time, I was training, I told them, I don't know if we're going to have class in a couple of days because we have this big storm coming, so just be safe. I didn't have any idea that it was going to be what it was. They later laughed at me because they thought it was an American's first experience in the monsoon season, and they thought I was just kind of being dramatic about a big monsoon coming that they were used to. But the embassy did have some sense of what was coming to some extent. I don't think they thought even they realized how big it was. But I believe, if memory serves me right, they alerted Burmese authorities who didn't do anything. There was no warning whatsoever. And then once it hit the the only action the Burmese authorities took was to block the roads and the paths and the rivers from people coming to deliver aid, which basically was a death sentence for those that had survived. A lot of my students and their friends were finding that had never been politically active or socially engaged in any way were taking it upon themselves to find ways to get aid in, and were setting up organizations on the fly to be able to get funds and to find a way through there. And then once the Nargis period passed, those relationships and those organizations and that social activity, that didn't go away. That was formed because of Nargis, and because that was they had to find a way through. But then once they realized what they could do, they were like, hey, we could do something else. We could also do this, or we could do that. And that started a new level of social engagement that I had never seen before, and that people that had never been involved in that area were now, and to this day, have now become quite socially engaged. And that all was born through just simply having to find a way to deliver aid to regions that the military was trying to block off. So
why was the military trying to do that?
Because it was embarrassing, because the fact that there was a natural disaster that had killed so many people and so many others were in a vulnerable state and they did not have the means or the interest to support them. It's always better for the military to cover up the stories of poverty and economic collapse and lack of opportunities and human rights than to address them. I did an interview recently with someone regarding Burmese film and cinema, and he was saying that everything had to be romanticized and idealized, because if you have a scene that talks about the conditions people are actually living in, you have to look at why they're in those conditions, and everything points back to the ineptitude of the government and the military. And so they wanted to simply close access and knowledge that this level of devastation and suffering was actually going on, because then it would alert to people to the fact that they weren't doing a very good job of administering aid to an opportunity to their own people. And so this is a normal story of the military, of just not taking care of a problem but trying to cover it up. So in any case, that awoke in many people, many Burmese, a civic duty that remained with them afterwards. But anyway, excuse me for this tangent, my own personal experience of being there. Yeah.
Can I say to ask about the Americans being denied access? I mean, I don't know if I ever saw this in a document or anything, but there was some serious concern about the Americans preparing to invade, and that was why they stopped the ships from coming in.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, this is all rumor mill. This is all tea shop gossip, as they say there. But certainly there was a fear that, and it was strongly negotiated, how the Americans would administer the aid. And eventually they ended up, if memory serves me right, they brought aid in through airplanes that, if memory serves me right, I think that there was a negotiation that the designation of that aid, saying, from the American government or USAID or whatever it was, they had to agree to strip it off, because the military did not want their own people to know that they could not provide that aid, but that it was coming from someone they said is the enemy. And to make matters worse, that then went on the black market, because I was living there at the time. So I remember, as this was developing day by day, many of those aid kits that came ended up going to the black market, and instead of distributed freely was ripped off for a profit. So it was really just a terrible man-made disaster on top of a natural disaster from start to finish. But I actually, coincidentally as well, just completely randomly, I had an acquaintance from college who told me years later that he was on one of those ships that was docked in the ocean waiting for word if they would be allowed to go to the Delta to administer aid. And they waited there for however long before they had to sail away.
Yeah. So the American Center was still functioning then?
It was thriving. It was a golden period at that time. It was, in fact, any time I get together with a student or a peer or an administrator that was there, this is getting off a little tangent as well, but it's kind of fun to share. That period that I was at the American Center was really one of the most precious of my life for several reasons. And I'd always seen it in kind of subjective ways of, what I was doing and involved in and how much I enjoyed it. But a few years ago, when I got together with some of the staff members that were involved, that it had something of an institutional history, they had said that period I was at was truly a golden years. It was a time that there was a synthesis of energy of what the country was going through, of the kind of students that were coming, the teachers that were present, the support we had from the administration, meaning the involvement in the embassy, that administration, that everything coming together created this incredible synthesis of a dynamicism of the programming that was offered, the cross-fertilization of different people working together, different programs that were being done in coordination. And so it was interesting to realize that my rosy subjective memory of how wonderful that period was in my life was actually from someone with institutional history. That was actually a very unique moment in the history of what the American Center was trying to do. So yeah, it's just very privileged to be a part of it.
So it must have been wonderful to be there. Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, it was, and it's great. It's so interesting talking now, a decade later, to people who were involved there from different aspects. Because I was a trainer, so I just have my own memory of what I was doing. But in talking, I've since gone back and talked to like 17, 18-year-old kids that just showed up, not speaking a word of English, and are now, very much involved in the current revolution, and have gone on to educate themselves in all kinds of ways. And to hear their view of what it was like to step into that place, of what it offered them, and even contrasting with the British Council that was also doing great work, and yet was a bit more formalized in some of their offerings. There was just a color and a potentiality that anyone walking in, no matter who you were, that you could do what you wanted. You could follow your passions, and you would have support for it, and you'd have camaraderie. And, so every month there was just, there were new and exciting things that were happening. And so, yeah, it was a special time.
Yeah, great. Jay.
So moving on past Nargis, we then have President Obama that takes office. I was there for the election. I also have warm memories of many Burmese watching an American election for the first time, and seeing democracy in play. And that was it's quite fascinating to be at that ground level view. But Obama takes over, and he does what is called what he terms pragmatic engagement. This is also the time that Thein Sein has taken over the reins, and he's starting to open up and to liberalize in different ways. I think one of the essential questions, for me at least, I don't know if you have a read on this, is as the country was opening up more, and we moved to the transition period, in those years right before the transition period, how much would you say was that being caused by what Thein Sein was doing and the direction that he, for whatever reason, wanted to bring society under, and how much was affected by Obama's policy at the time?
I don't know if I can put that into any specific, percentages or whatnot. I think the Americans contributed to the change. I don't think the Americans caused the change, but I don't know, how much credit they're due. I say in the book that I think the Americans should not be credited with the bringing about the change, but at the same time, I don't think their influence should be entirely underestimated. We were the major power in the world at that time, and Obama took real interest in Southeast Asian affairs. Of course, he had lived in Indonesia for a while. So I think the influence that he brought was not insignificant. I do say in the book that, there's a bigger question about sanctions. But let me go back to Obama, if I could, for just a minute here. When he came into office, the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, realized that although the sanctions were well intended and so forth, they hadn't produced any change or any obvious change. And so they had this review of policy, what it should be, and they did come up with this idea, as you said, of pragmatic engagement, of keeping the sanctions in place, but trying to open up avenues of discussion with the government, not intending to oust the government, but to moderate the government or bring about some kind of change. And they ultimately decided on this idea of pragmatic engagement, which did not immediately produce any dividends. It took some time to produce some dividends, but eventually did, beginning in 2010, and then more so in 2011 when Hillary Clinton went to Burma, and then, of course, Obama goes there after his election in 2012 to kind of a triumphant entry into Burma and celebrating the changes which have already taken place. I think they did come about with remarkable speed. I talked with U Tin Oo. I had a chance to talk with him in Yangon when I was there, and he says it came across with we could not even believe how fast it happened. So it was a euphoric period.
Right, and I have a question about that speed before just another quick anecdote. When Obama came for his visit to Myanmar, at that time I was no longer working at the embassy. I was pursuing meditation. I was staying at monasteries, and I was in a monastery studying meditation at the time of his visit, but I did not have a meditation visa, which was the proper one to be in a monastery. It usually didn't matter. I had a tourist visa, but the monasteries all around were so concerned about how strict authorities were being and all the security for Obama's visit that they kicked me out for 3 days. For the day before and the day after Obama's visit, they said, you have to leave because we'll get in trouble if they find you there. So I was kicked out of the monastery, went to Yangon, was traveling back to Yangon at the time he came, and I literally could not get a room in Yangon. There were no hotel rooms, high or low, of any kind for his visit. And it wasn't just, I don't mean to suggest that was because everyone was coming to Yangon for his visit, because it was very short. It was more that at that time, the economic change had happened so fast that the hotel infrastructure had not caught up. And there was a period there where, and with Clinton and Obama's visit kind of legitimizing that it was now open for business and open for tourism, there was an entire infrastructure that had been completely empty for decades. And then for years after, we just had enormous, terrible construction everywhere because everyone was trying to catch up, and then it bounced the other way. But there was that period right around his visit and on the day of his visit where there just literally weren't any rooms at all. But my question with the transition was, at this time, I have an interesting perspective because I was so involved prior to the transition. And then right when things started to get exciting, my job finished and I was in monasteries. I wasn't even really following the news. I was following a spiritual path at that time and just kind of getting bits and pieces of what was happening. And with my knowledge of Burmese history and hearing the developments that were taking place, I think there was a bit of skepticism of like the one step forward, two steps back. And I think that was not unique to me. I think that many followers really didn't feel that it was genuine, because in so many other instances it wasn't. It was just playing games to try to continue their rule. So is there any point beyond which you think that people realized it was genuine? Was there any watershed moment where there became an awareness that, well, maybe this is different from before, and that signified that a change really was in the air?
I think the elections of, 2011? Was that when they had the election for the by-election for Parliament? There were 45 seats up for grabs. They allowed Aung San Suu Kyi to be out and campaigning. And the NLD won 43 out of the 45 seats. And, that was not a full election for Parliament, but it was a big one. And I at least my sense was that really marked some feeling that this was actually going to happen. There may have been others as well, but that's the one that occurs to me.
And that's right around, a few years later when your book leaves off. I think it was 2015 when it was published. And 2015 is really the year that the transition in earnest begins. And so that's not so documented in the book. How would you characterize the years after 2015 and Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD truly takes power?
Yeah, well, of course, as you say, the election takes place just after the book was published, so I didn't have that in it. But I had things leading up to it. And that was a tremendous victory for Aung San Suu Kyi, and for the NLD. And we all thought that things were fine. I think we didn't pay enough attention to the privileges that the military still had. As they had 25% of the seats in Parliament regardless of the votes. And they still controlled the military, and they controlled the Home Office, and so they had, and because they had 25% of the Parliament, they could veto any changes to the Constitution. So I think Aung San Suu Kyi and I mean, we felt, at least I felt, well, this is really good. It's going to be a change, maybe a lasting change. And then, of course, came the election of 2021, and the election which the NLD also won again overwhelmingly, and then, of course, comes the actually it was 2020, and then comes the coup in February a year ago, which led to all the disasters since then, and so. it's such a disappointment, and yet in a sense it's just returning to the way it used to be.
And just backing up a little before the military coup, how would, because you didn't cover this in the book since the book was printed before this, and I'm quite curious, how would you characterize the relations between, as you wrote a book on U.S.-Burma relations, there's now 5 years where U.S.-Burma relations are NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi. How would you characterize relations during that period?
Oh, I think they were very good, except for, as you know, Aung San Suu Kyi. The military, of course, and its atrocities against the Rohingyas. That was held up even to me by the U.S. Embassy in Burma, even as early as 2000. And when did I talk to them? 2000. Well, I talked to them in 2000. I talked with Michael Thurston maybe in 2011, who was the chargé there before the ambassador was appointed. And he said, that this is the one remaining issue, that the problems that the Burmese have with the Rohingyas and the other ethnic groups is a remaining problem. But then of course, Aung San Suu Kyi lost her luster when she defended the military in the international court and refused to speak in favor of the Rohingyas. And the big question we all had, at least I had, was, what does she really believe? She's a Burman, so maybe she shares the antipathy that many Burmans had toward Muslims and the Rohingyas. Some of the political prisoners who were political prisoners in 1988, didn't love the Rohingyas at all. It's hard to find anybody who did. And so I wondered if she, whether she really felt that way. The best you can say, and I think this may be the way it was, is that she felt that if you could work with the military long enough, win the elections in 2020, then you could bring about some real changes. And maybe she felt that the Rohingyas could recover or be treated more fairly after that. If that was the bet, of course, it didn't work out because the coup happened, and even though Aung San Suu Kyi had been defensive of the military. So I think the American government was, of course, well, I don't know with Trump whether I don't really know. Well, I think Trump probably knew nothing at all about Burma, but the American government was I think expressing some disregard for Aung San Suu Kyi because of that.
Well, Trump really did know very little about Burma, and that could be attested in one video where he was welcoming different. I can't quite remember the context of the video, but there were about a dozen award winners of some freedom or some honor or something, and there's a shot of the Burmese person, or it might be from some ethnicity, but from Myanmar, coming to accept the award. And Trump says, "Where are you from?" And the person gives the answer. And there's an exchange where it clearly shows that Trump does not know which country he's referring to or where it's located. So, I think that as you do your sequel post 2015, maybe you can find that video clip. This is why I think this book is so relevant and interesting for the current moment, because as where so many people are concerned and trying to understand the current situation that's going on in Burma, we see the same themes repeated in different ways that you've cataloged in this book. The role of China, from the American side, who do they support? Who do they support? And how do they support them? What will bring greater stability? What will bring greater unrest? And you have the different ethnics and the EAOs that are engaging in one way, and then you have the Central Burman Authority that they've, as we talked about at the very start of this conversation, where they chose to support, who they chose to support at the outset in the post-war period. Those same dynamics are at play. Obviously, human rights, democracy, that are taking place. Aung San Suu Kyi is still a central figure in all of this. And when one is looking at the current Burma bill that's trying to be passed, and friends of mine that are involved in that and quite involved in the lobbying and conversations with McConnell's office, and just how what the personal feelings of admiration and appreciation that McConnell continues to have to Aung San Suu Kyi specifically in guiding the overall legislation, how important that personal relationship and feelings continue to be. And then, of course, just the state of revolution that's going on, and how whether support is given in covertly or with any kinds of materials that might be given to support that revolution, which is really just talk, is not happening in any form. But it's the same cycles, just as it did not happen in any form with what UNU was trying to do. So the fact that it's not happening doesn't mean that it's not relevant and present. It was also talked about before and didn't happen before as well. But these same cycles are still occurring in how we're trying to understand the present moment and the U.S.-Myanmar relations. So as someone who has studied this for the last half century and more, are there any thoughts or insights or reflections you have when you're watching the present day play out, especially in the last year and a half?
Let me just say on that last point about Americans helping the resistance movement. There was an essay that was written by Marvin Oth, whom I mentioned earlier, and he's very well connected with with intelligence and everything along that line, in which he suggested that the United States should assist militarily, covertly, the resistance movements in Burma. And I was shocked that he would say that. But if he says it, I think he's reflecting, as you say, scuttlebutt that's being talked about in the halls. He would know about that, as if there might be some movement along that line. Yeah, I don't know, but you might. I don't immediately remember where that is. You might look it up. It just Marvin Oth, and in a recent essay that he wrote at the Wilson Center. I was at the Wilson Center, so I wrote to him and said I was glad to see he was back into Burma things, and was surprised at that. And he said something to the effect of, well, it's sort of, he hears these things. So I don't know. But in answer to your general question, this is just repeating the way Burma has been for most of the time since 1945. But there is a difference, of course, in that the people had a number of years, especially the younger generation, right, who had a number of years that were quite different than before. They're not necessarily all in for Aung San Suu Kyi. They want wider reforms than she was involved with. They've had internet now. They grew up with the internet. They all have cell phones. As you know, when you were there, you couldn't have a cell phone unless you paid thousands of dollars for it, or getting a chip, a SIM card. They're just a whole different generation, and they're not going to put up with it. And Marvin Oth also made the point in this essay, incidentally, that the military is fighting for its life, and that they may not control much more than their bases. So in that sense, it was kind of optimistic about the outcome of things in Burma. The new generation is just not going to allow it maybe to go back to the way it was. So I kind of hope that's true.
Yeah, we all do, and I know your focus is looking backwards, but in looking backwards, it informs what's happening today and forwards. And so I think this is we learn a lot from understanding things that incidences that we think, as we referenced on today's conversation, that we think went a certain way were actually a bit different at the time. And I think that's really the value of the book and what you bring out in understanding how things appeared in that moment through the prism of whether it was breaking free from colonialism and independence, or fighting off communism, or the war on drugs, that these were the prisms through which things were analyzed and understood. And today's the way so many of us see it today, rightly so, is through this prism of this earnest democracy movement to keep their freedoms that the transition provided, and through understanding the goal of human rights throughout Burma, and of the ethnics and marginalized communities, and how important that is. But it's so important to go back and realize that in different moments in history and in that relation, that those did not have the priority that they had now, and that people and things were seen differently. And I just got enormous value from reading that, and from this discussion.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I think we like to think that what we write about the past has some relevance to the present time. So I do appreciate that.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today. And before we go, are there any other observations or thoughts you wanted to share before we close?
I don't know if I have any pronouncements or anything. I'd just be curious about your own experiences in Burma. How long were you there? When did you go, and so forth?
I first went in 2003, and actually I was going to make a little book note of you mentioned about the internet, and my first memory in going in 2003, there was no internet whatsoever. There weren't even any cyber cafes, and I was there a month for meditation at that time before I came back for work. And between meditation courses, I wanted to send an email to my mom that I had arrived. So I had to go to a cyber cafe. I couldn't log into any account. I had to use their official government account and write a message saying, I'm here and blah, blah, blah. And then it cost $1 or something to send that email. And the next morning, I guess I had told them the guest house I was staying, I don't remember. But the next morning I get a knock on the door. And I get, and there's an envelope, and I open it up, and it's a printed copy of my mom's reply to that cyber cafe that they had, to their address that they had printed and sent. So it was this hilarious combination of 19th century and 21st century, like an email that was delivered as a telegram, and I paid another $1 for that message that came. And so that was, I was there from the time that internet just simply didn't exist. And when the smartphone revolution kicked off, all of my friends, American and Burmese, we were reading about what smartphones were and how they were affecting the culture. And none of us understood it, because none of us, we were talking about it like it was just a parallel universe. We'd have conversations about what are these things? And, none of us had really ever seen one. And then, of course, through Facebook and Wi-Fi and everything else, just seeing the society change at warp speed from where it was before. So yeah, a lot of personal experience there. So with that, thank you so much for joining us here. I really encourage listeners to check out this book, A Delicate Relationship. If you found the conversation interesting, there's a lot in there. There's a lot more detail from where we went. And thanks so much for joining us and sharing these observations.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure to be here. I really enjoyed talking with you.
We'd like to take this time to thank our generous supporters who have already given. We simply cannot continue to provide you with this content and information without the wonderful support of generous listeners, donors, and friends like you. Each episode helps in providing access to one more voice, one more perspective, one more insight. Every donation of any size is greatly appreciated, and it helps us to continue this mission. We greatly appreciate your generosity, which allows us to maintain this platform and everything else we do. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go to support a wide range of humanitarian missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person, IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and much more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution for a specific activity or project you would like to support. perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian aid work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org. That's BETTERBURMA.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit cards. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either the Insight Myanmar or Better Burma websites for specific links to those respective accounts, or email us at info@betterburma.org. If you'd like to give in another way, please contact us. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.